If you want to jump to Habakkuk, we are going to start in chapter 2 this morning. So we took a while going through verse 1, and then we hit verse 2, and we read verse 3, but didn't really discuss verse 3. So we're gonna back up and reread verse 2 and 3 of chapter 2, and we'll go over that. Oh, I just want to also remind you guys that June and July, there's going to be a chunk there where I won't be able to lead. So if you are interested in leading, you could go. It doesn't have to be over Habakkuk. It could be over something else, one of your favorite verses or passages. Please let me know. And I got to start setting that up pretty soon on what we're going to do in June and July. All right. Let's see, where was I? Chapter 2. So last week we were going through Habakkuk, and chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk tells us what he's going to do. He's going to watch and he's going to wait for the Lord to speak to him. And then in verse 2, God starts responding back to Habakkuk again. And I know I've mentioned this before. It's just incredible that they're having this kind of conversation. We don't know the timing of it. We don't know if Habakkuk had to wait, an hour or 2 days or 2 weeks. We don't know, but it's still pretty cool that he has something specific he's asking God, and God's responding, and they're having a conversation. So let's get back to, let's read verse 2 and 3, and then we'll start getting into it. And let's see, Bill, can you read verse 2 and 3?
Sure. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits the appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not provide false. Will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay.
All right. So we see here in verse 2 and 3. In verse 2, we talked about a little bit about how he tells Habakkuk to write it plainly on tablets. And this idea here that God has is that he wants them to understand what he's saying. Okay, so he's telling them, write it plainly on the tablets, and so when people read it, not only will they understand, but they'll respond and they'll do something. And he mentions that they who read it may run with it, or as Bill said, a herald may take it and go and run with it. So this is one of those things that we want to understand about God, is when he tells us something, he wants us to understand it, right? He tells it to us in a way that we can understand. He could, speak to us in a language we didn't know, right? He could say, hey, I'm going to speak to you, but I'm only going to speak to you in Chinese. And the only way for you to understand it is if you learn Chinese so you can understand me. But he doesn't do that here. He takes it and he gives it to them in a way that they can understand. So it's plain, and he gives it to them. And there's a key point here that we want to catch, which is God wants us to understand what he's telling us, right? He's not telling us for his benefit, it's for our benefit. So it's important to him that we understand. It's important to him, and maybe understanding is not the right word. It's important to him that it's clear and we have the ability to understand. Maybe that's a better way of saying it, right? Because he wants it to be clear. But it is quite often that God tells us something and we don't understand. And so how do we reconcile these two things? And here's this cool part that we get in verse 3. And I think this is an important lesson for us as well. He says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and it will not lie. And here's this idea here that God is saying is he's going to tell you something. You may not understand it, but it's clear, so that when it comes true, you do understand it. Because one of those things about God is he knows a lot more than we do, and he can reveal something to us that happens in a future time. And you can be like, I don't understand, God. How, maybe God's saying, I'm going to have you doing this work over in Arizona. And I say Arizona because Mark just popped up on the screen. But he's like, I want you to be over there in Arizona doing this thing. And you're like, I don't understand. I'm here in the Central Valley, or I'm here in the Bay Area in California. That I don't understand. And so he told you something clear, but you didn't quite get it. And one of the reasons you didn't get it is because you just haven't gotten close enough to that goal to understand how that's going to all work out. And that's another issue, is he tells us things, but he doesn't give us all the details that we necessarily want. But that doesn't mean he doesn't give us enough information to do something. And remember, we saw that in verse 2. He writes the vision on a tablet so that people can take it and run with it. But at the same time, he's telling them it's for the future. It's for an appointed time. It hasn't happened yet. And I like that at verse 3. But at the end, it will speak and it will not lie. And so here's this cool thing that we have to understand about hearing from God, is sometimes we don't fully understand it because it's in the future. It's for something that we just don't have enough information yet, but we will. And the key point we have to take away from this is what God told us is true.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring up an example, and then we can talk about this a little bit more before we get to this Terry part. But an example that I can think of is when Jesus is on earth and he's in his ministry and he has his disciples and he tells them he's going to die. And he tells them he's going to come back to life in 3 days, right? They totally, he was plain. We can read it in the passage and you can read it and go, that was totally clear. And yet for the apostles, it went right over their heads. They did not understand it, right? They're like, I heard it, but I don't get it. And then when he dies, they're just totally distraught and broken and don't realize he's going to come back to life, even though he told it to them. I don't know. What do you guys think?
There's a word for that. Trust.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Trust in the Lord.
But if let's say I told you guys, okay, I'm going to die in 3 days and I'm going to be raised up in 3 days, you're going to go, yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Because they still didn't understand that Jesus was God.
Yeah.
They still didn't get that part. And that's really where they were at, is like, yeah, right. And then when he died, it's like, now what are we going to do? Because they still didn't get that he was God until they physically saw him and they could, yeah. So there's plenty of crazy people out there saying, yeah, I'm going to be raised from the dead in 3 days. And you're going to go, yeah, right. Well, let's see if that really happens.
But there's an important point there, I think, that you're making too, Sean, which is sometimes God tells us something and we don't understand it because we don't recognize that this is how God is, or this is how God will work. And it's not that we don't know that God is God. Sometimes we just forget about some of the aspects of who he is and some of his personality. And we're like, and even with Habakkuk here, right? God's telling him, I'm going to send the Babylonians to take your land. And he knows who God is. He's willing to submit to him, but he's like, you can't do that. So it's interesting.
I also think that, it wasn't, if you contrast it to people that might say those things, we would know simply because if we know those people, they haven't proven themselves in anything else either. Now, what's interesting over Jesus is over 3 years, he's been doing miracle after miracle. And of course, he raised Lazarus from the dead. He raised that little girl from the dead. So it's just interesting that I wouldn't say not breadcrumbs, but, sort of kernels of not evidence or truth, just God leading us faith to faith to faith to faith to help us understand some things because he's already shown that he can. But the interesting thing with people is a lot of times we're obstinate and we live by sight. And because at the end conclusion of what we think is happening isn't palatable. So we just pass all the evidence of everything else, right? It's like, I don't want Jesus to die. I don't care what he says, whether he can rise again, because the way I think of him dying is totally different. And might sometimes be disconnected from what he's already done before, because we're so afraid of what's happening or what could happen when God says something. And it's just, interesting dynamic there too.
Yeah.
Hey, And John, I think it's really awesome and amazing how even in spite of us missing those breadcrumbs, he's able to package all of that together and say, hey, just look over your shoulder. Just look over there, you know, and able to utilize that even when we miss it and help us along. And it's a loving father that just like, you know what, I understand you're not there yet, but you know what, I'm gonna point you in the right direction. We're going to utilize where you are plus what I've already done, even though it's painfully obvious. And we're going to package that to where you can now have something to stand upon and you can see it by the evidence.
Yeah. It is really cool that he does this, right? He doesn't have to tell us of these things. He could just say, trust in me because I am who I am, but he doesn't. And he tells us these things and he tells them to us clearly and plainly, and we still don't get it. And he's still like, I still love you, and I'm still going to keep telling you these things. And then let's get to the last part of verse 3, because I like this part too, where he says, though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. And in my translation, it says tarries twice, which is a little unfortunate because it's two different words. Tim, what does your version say? Yours is usually interesting.
Verse 3, for as yet the vision is far off, and it shall appear at the end and shall not lie. If it make any delay, wait for it shall surely come and shall not be slack. Yeah.
So so this first word of though it tarries, the idea here is that it's taking a long time to happen. So he says, though it tarries, wait for it. And this idea here is it may not seem quick enough to you. It may seem like it's off in the future, but it's gonna happen. So wait for it. And then the second version of tarry, he says, it will not tarry. It's this idea of procrastination. It's not going to be slack, as Tim said, or his version said. It's not going to be procrastinated. It's not going to be late, is the point that God's making. He is saying, though it seems like it's far off and it's taking a long time to happen, it's going to happen exactly when he wanted it to happen. And that's this idea that he has here, is it might seem like it takes a long time for us, but it's going to happen at the perfect time, according to his plan. And so I like that idea for it, that it's it might take a while, but our perspective of time is so different than his. And so he's just warning us, right? It's going to happen, even if it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And then I like what he says. He says, though it tarries, wait for it. What do you think it means to wait for it?
Be patient.
Okay.
Be patient. It's going to happen when I want it to happen, and just be patient and trust me, and it'll work out like it should.
Yeah.
I would say keep building, keep warning people. It may be in your child's generation, but you want to train up that child so they can carry on the message. Don't just sit there, twiddling your thumbs, putting your hard hat on, going in your bunker and hiding out until it actually.
Yeah, it's like the magician says, wait for it, and your expectation is this is what's going to happen, and it's truly just as Elijah said, just you need to be patient, but you need to also be telling people, hey, wait for it, check this out. It's like seeing the signs. We're seeing the signs for the end times, but we need to wait for it. Because it's coming, but it may not be in our lifetime, but it may be, but it's coming, and we need to let people know that it's coming.
Elijah brings up an interesting point in regards to our children and giving this information to them, because Habakkuk or any other prophet might just think, okay, well, this is the end, and I don't need to do anything else because everybody's going to be, either slaughtered or taken away into captivity, and this is where it all stops. But obviously, that's not the case, and to continue the information on to the second generation or the preceding generation, that's critical.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent, right? And this is one of those things where we want to catch that when he's saying wait for it, that's something he's telling us to be active about this vision that's happening. Sorry, my dog is scratching to get out. I gotta let him out.
Don't let the dog out.
Yeah, I just had a flashback of when you did that video, John.
It's been a while. I should bring it back. So anyways, this wait for it, this is an active thing that he wants us to do. It's not okay, it's going to happen, and don't get into this mentality. If it's going to happen in the future, it's going to happen some other time, so you can ignore it, right? It's the opposite of ignoring it. It's the opposite of just assuming it'll happen, but since some other time. It is a wait for it. And I liked one of the words that Sean said. There's this expectation that it's going to happen. So we want to have that expectation, live with that expectation. And this is how we are supposed to be with the return of Jesus, right? It's not supposed to be this idea that Jesus is going to return and it's probably not going to be in our lifetime, so don't worry about it. It's a wait for it. He's going to return. It might happen in our children's time, but it might happen today. So keep an eye out for it. And I like this idea of keeping an eye out for it. Keep it in the forefront of your mind. So it's not just a wait for it, but when you're seeing something, take a double take. Is that happening? Is this happening right now? And I think that's how we should be with the return of Jesus. Is, you hear something on the news and you're like, man, that's crazy. Wait a second. Does that mean Jesus is coming? Is he coming today? Maybe. Right. So I like this whole aspect of wait for it. Keep it on the forefront of your mind. It would be awesome if the Lord returned today, and I say he should do it, but he doesn't. That's not up to me. Probably good for you guys, because yeah,
I'm ready.
See, the other thing is the goal is that you be preaching the gospel to someone, they
Yeah.
get saved, and the rapture happens.
yeah.
Then you can be up there saying, "Yep, I was the one. I got the last one."
That's right. And that goes along with the verse before it, right? Make it plain on the tablets that he may run who reads it. So there's this idea. He's given us the vision. He wants us to have the passion so that we can warn other people. And although it might not happen today, wait for it. It's going to happen, and still contain and keep that passion to let other people, warn other people. It's going to happen. Yeah.
The other neat thing is he says to write it on the tablets. He didn't say write it on the papyrus or the scrolls or any of those other things. He said write it on something that's very permanent, so that it would be there for a while, because it's not going to happen right now, but it's going to happen.
Yeah. And there's also this idea, right, that when it does happen, you can look back and see what he says, and you can match it up and say, it happened exactly as he said it. He's that confident of what he's saying, right? That's what God is. He's saying it's going to happen. You can write it down. When it happens, you can validate and verify it's going to happen exactly as he said it's going to happen. I like that too, because there's a lot of confidence.
That also provides a record so that you can see that and understand it happened exactly when it's going to happen. So in the future, you can think back about that God was true to his word in the past.
Yeah.
He'll be true to his word again.
That's right. That's right. And he's done that many times throughout the Bible, right? He's done that where he said, this is going to happen. And then later on, that's exactly what happens. Sometimes it takes thousands of years before it happens, right? There's the promise of a Messiah. If you look, you can find that promise way back in Genesis, all the way back to Genesis 3, right? There's the promise that he's going to send someone to save mankind, and it takes thousands of years to happen. But when it happens, you can look back and say, bam, just how he said. That was incredible. I like, one of my favorite verses is Isaiah 49:6. And there's this phrase that Isaiah writes down, and he says that the God of salvation will be a light to the Gentiles. And one of the reasons I like it is because that word God of salvation, it's actually Yeshua. It's Jesus. And I'm wondering, is that a prophecy of the name? Is that one of those things where we could look back and say, he even told us the name of the Messiah right there? But that's the way he works. So let's get to verse 4, and we're going to get through, I'm looking at the time. We're going to try to do verse 4, and yeah, we're just going to, let's just do it. Let's see. Jake, can you read verse 4? Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4?
Yes, sir. Look at the proud. They trust in themselves, and their lives are crooked. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God.
Yeah. So this is one of those verses. This is probably the most famous verse of Habakkuk, which all of you have heard to some degree, but maybe not realized it's in Habakkuk because it's also in some other passages. But here God tells, now notice who's saying this. This is God who's saying this. He says, in my version, it says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. And so this is this cool contrast that we get. We're seeing God contrast two people and he's putting them in two categories. There's the proud and there's the just. And there's some interesting things about that. I just want to remind you, when we were all the way back looking, when we started this book, we looked at Psalms 52, and David makes this exact same comparison. He says there's two types of people. There's the mighty man, and there's the one who trusts in the mercy of the Lord. Those are the only two types of people that there are. And it's interesting that David recognized that, and we get all the way here, and God is telling us the exact same thing. There's two types of people. There's the proud and there's the just. So let's start by talking about this proud person. Does anybody's version say something other than proud?
Mine says,
Puffed up.
behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the
Okay,
just shall live by his faith.
so lifted up.
The enemy is puffed up.
Puffed up? Yeah, I like that. I like that. Are you using ESV?
That's the NIV.
NIV. He said, and Bob's, it says, behold, he is puffed up. And I like this picture of the proud. He is puffed up. So you get this idea of someone who's standing tall, standing straight with their chest kind of out. And they're like, yeah, I'm all of that. But I also like this other aspect of it. If you're puffed up, what are you filled with? Right? You're just filled with wind. You're just filled with air. And here's the interesting thing about being proud. It's all a bluff, right? It's not true. It's not real. Even if you are claiming to be some great and amazing person, some righteous person, if you're honest, you'll recognize that you're not that, right? And I like this because this is kind of how God describes it. In verse 4, he says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him. So we have this picture of someone who's standing up straight, and God saying, but his soul's not straight. Right. It's not standing upright. And so there's this contrast of the person who is proud, but they also recognize that they're really not as great as they think they are. If they were honest, they would recognize that they're not as great as they think they are. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think people realize that they aren't so great? Or do you think that there's a lot of people who have literally and fully deceive themselves to think that they are amazing people?
I'm guilty of that. I used to, especially in my younger days, I used to be very proud of myself. And I had the opportunity to be humbled and had a lot of time to think and realize I was definitely not as great as I thought I was. So yeah, sometimes things have to happen to where you sit and reflect, and sometimes you keep them the glasses on, the lenses, and you never see it, unfortunately.
Do you think that people never see it? People never recognize that they are not perfect?
I think maybe they won't vocalize it. Maybe they won't come to terms to be able to say that to other people. But I think there are some people that think their defecation doesn't have fragrance.
I like
Mine
that.
doesn't. But the thing is that I don't know if you remember the old what was it with the Fonzie couldn't say the word "I was wrong," and he was struggling with just getting that word out. And I think that's where people have their issue, is admitting that their mistakes are. And a lot of people first and foremost try to blame someone else for
Yeah.
whatever's wrong with them. It's somebody else. And I think that's all part of pride. I
Yeah.
know that's what I'm guilty of, because I'm very defensive. When I make a mistake, it's like, well, something else caused it, The sun was in my eyes, I dropped the ball because the sun was in my eyes, It's the sun's fault, not mine. So, yeah.
And I think, the human nature side of it also will do everything possible to suppress it, right? Whatever conviction you might have. We know the Holy Spirit's in the world to convict the world of sin, righteousness, and of judgment. So everybody knows they're guilty of something. but there's also this collective effort to sort of push the balloon in the pool, in the water, underwater, and just kind of keep it there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that balloon will eventually pop up simply by nature. It'll just come up. But I think that's probably where the gist is. God's doing his part because he says he will. I mean, the Holy Spirit's here convicting people, but whether they respond or try to suppress it and suppress the truth that convicts them is a whole different thing. And that's where the human heart goes wrong, I think.
Yeah. This is one of the aspects of the gospel that people are afraid of, I think. And maybe they aren't, but it seems to me that people are afraid of. And I don't think we should be afraid of it, because it's a powerful part to recognize that we are sinners. And there's a lot of people where if they could recognize that they were sinners, they would be halfway there to receiving Christ, right? That's just a gigantic hurdle. And people need to hear it. Dude, you're messed up, right? And we understand that. We are crooked, as God says here.
And that's
All right.
the interesting part. I'm sorry, John. One last thing.
No,
I
go
think
ahead.
that's the interesting part of sharing our testimony, because
Yeah.
people are messed up in different ways. And as believers, we need to be open about our shortcomings and our sinful nature, so that people can understand even that kind of guy or that kind of girl can recover or can be saved from that kind of thing. Because God saves out of every tribe and tongue and every situation. And I think that's part of the reason why we go through the things that we go through, so that at the end of the day, you become an example that the grace of God goes to every corner, and we need to be open about that, because somebody probably is going through the same thing or the same struggles or the same sort of denial that some of us have already gone through, and that road is sometimes a very helpful. It's a paved road through your life. And when you tell it, it becomes a road for other people to travel and see where the Lord is.
Yeah. All right. So he says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in, but the just shall live by his faith. One of the things that I like this is God's contrasting that there's two types of people here, right? There's the proud and there's the just. And what I really think is amazing is we don't think of the opposite of proud as the just, but that's the comparison that God's making. And again, we saw that with Psalms 52, when David is comparing the wicked, the mighty man and the one who trusts in the mercy of the Lord. Those aren't opposite. It doesn't seem like those are opposites, right? It seems like the opposite of a proud man, if we were going to contrast everybody, put them into two categories. One category is the proud, and another category would be the meek, right? But that's not what God is saying. He's saying there's the proud, there's the ones who think that they're righteous, but they're not righteous. And then catch the other category. Then there's the just, those who are actually righteous. And it's really interesting that he contrasts them in this way, I think, because he's saying there's those who feel like they're righteous, who are puffed up, but it's all a bluff. They're not righteous. And then you have those who are just. They're justified. They're righteous in his eyes. Remember, this is God saying this. He's saying those who are just. And what's really cool is if there's two categories of people, that means you can belong to one of those categories of people, right? So how do you not end up in the proud category? And I love how God does this. He tells you the just shall live by his faith. So there's the answer right there. You want to be one of those people who is not proud and feels like they're righteous. You want to be one who's actually righteous. Then you got to do this other part. He has to be the one who lives by his faith. What do you think it means to live by his faith?
I think trusting in the Lord in all decisions and situations. Like in this situation right here, the Babylonians are going to come and bring havoc, but we stand strong in the belief that it's part of God's plan, and God's plan, he's going to win, and what God wants to happen is going to happen. So you better learn to accept it. You don't necessarily need to like it, but don't try to stop it.
I'm going to give you guys another second, but I'm excited to talk about this. So what do you guys think about it as what he's saying is just? Or I'm sorry, to live by faith.
When you live by your faith, it's not just words, like it's your actions, it's the way you talk, it's the way you present yourself in your house, the way you live is how you live by your faith. That's what's going on the inside, not just what people see on the outside, because anybody can talk about having faith, but it's
like it
acting out that faith, So,
I like the metaphor, practice what you preach. And I think of the Pharisees and how Jesus just rained down on them hard in regards to their hypocrisy and what they were doing and how they lived their lives, and compared them to the dirty cup, the whitewashed dirty cup.
The whitewashed graves, filled with a dead
too.
body.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was mixing my metaphors there.
It's all right. It's allowed.
At the simplest level, I think the way I explain to my kids is just believe what God says. And because he's revealed it. Now it's a different matter if he's never revealed it, but when he does, we have to believe what he says, and that of course translates to actions most of the time, one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think it's also just believing in God in the sense of what Jesus said when he healed people, like the centurion who he wasn't really going to heal, or the woman, the Syrian woman. He says, we don't feed the little dogs, but by her faith in Jesus Christ, knowing that he could do it, that you will be healed. And I think that's what we need to walk, is we need to walk by faith, in the sense that knowing that he's going to take care of it. He's in control.
Yeah.
He's got the ball, and it's his game. And we just need to trust in that. And that's probably the hardest part for us, is because we as men want to take control, and giving up control is what walking by faith is okay, Lord, you want me to do this thing. I don't want to do it, but it's going to happen. So you're going to do it one way or the other.
Yeah. And also it's not just wanting to take control, but also when we're going in completely the wrong direction that we want to go in, right? When God's saying, it's going to end over here. And you're like, but I want to go over there. I don't want to go through this hard thing right here. And he's saying, no, you've got to trust in it, because you're going to end up over on this side. If you go on your own, you're not. Yeah, I love this. This is all fantastic. I love it. So in verse 4, he says it. I'm going to read it again. He says, "Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him." And then I want to contrast to this here, where the proud's righteousness, God's saying his feeling like he's righteous, but it's in his soul. He's got his own righteousness. And guess what? It's not upright. It's not straight. And then contrast with the just here. The just shall live by his faith. The point that I'm making here, I want to point out here is that your righteousness doesn't come from your own soul, right? That's a big contrast between the just and the proud. The proud, their righteousness comes from within themselves. The just, their righteousness comes from the one that they put their trust in. And so here's this great contrast of we are just and we are righteous, but it's not because of who we are or what we are, right? It's not because of the righteousness within ourselves. It's because we put our trust in Jesus and he is actually righteous. He is purely and truly righteous, and we get to have his righteousness. And so it's just this really cool aspect here that I really like. And I like how you guys all focused on this living aspect of it. You know, we live by his faith. We actually, and here's this thing, right? Here's this idea. Trusting isn't saying you trust someone. Trusting is actually trusting in someone. There's got to be some actions that you do that verify that you actually trust in him. There's a common story, and you probably have all heard it before. I'm not 100% sure if it's true, or at least all the details of it are true. But there was this guy. He really was a guy. He was a tightrope walker. And he had a rope across the Niagara Falls, and he could walk back and forth, and he would take stuff with him, take an umbrella. Once he took and this is all part of this is true. He once took a wheelbarrow and filled it with like potatoes or something and took it across the thing. And then he gets back and then he says, "How many of you guys believe that I could take a person in the wheelbarrow and take them across?" And everybody's like, yeah, you could. Right? But that's not the trust, because the trust part is when he says, "Okay, who's going to get in the wheelbarrow and let me push them across?" There's the trust part, right? And that's what God is telling us here. When you live by his faith, that means you're not just saying that you're trusting him, but you're actually willing to get in that wheelbarrow and let him push you across. All right. We have 15 minutes, and I want to cover one other aspect of this verse, which I think is amazing, but it's a little bit of a stretch. So you guys are going to have to bear with me a little bit. And here is this aspect that we see here, that God is telling Habakkuk this. And I just want to bring us back to Habakkuk and recognize the time period that Habakkuk is in, because Habakkuk is in this time before Christ was born. And here we have God telling them, the just shall live by his faith. And a lot of times when we hear this verse, we're going to think of Hebrews and some other passages which are after Jesus. And so we're going to understand, yes, we put our trust in Jesus, but these people didn't have Jesus yet, right? They didn't have that. So here's a crazy question. What does this mean for these people who are before Christ? How are they saved? If they're saved by their faith, what are they saved? What is their faith in? What are they saved by? You guys have any thoughts? I have a thought, but I want to give people opportunity to give their own thoughts.
Well, their faith is in God, and
Okay.
throughout the Bible, God has helped his chosen people over and over again. When they got in trouble, sometimes things didn't go well, but eventually he would always get the lineage that Jesus will come from through things and took care of them.
Yeah. All right.
I hate to say this, but the law. They have the
Okay.
law.
They have the
And
law.
They have what God has told them how to live their lives. And so
Okay.
if they are followers of God, then they would follow his rules. And so because they don't have Jesus, which comes along and says, I'm not here to get rid of the law. I'm here to fulfill the law.
Fulfill it. Okay.
And
I
so
like that.
that's really what they have, is they have God, as Bill said, that's who their trust is in, God. They have all these miracles, they have all this stuff passed down, just as we do, because we have the Bible, but these are all, as people point out, these are all stories from men. We're believing that God inspired these men to write these words, and that this word is from God. And so that's where our faith is. But for them, who wrote the law? God. So
Okay. I like it. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think those two thoughts are connected, right? Because the mystery of God, who he is, was expressed. His character was expressed through the law. Now, whether you think it was valid or you think it was a hassle is a whole different story. Like, imagine all the law that you have to do every day, and then every week there's some ceremony, and then every few months there's another thing. There's a lot of costs involved in all this. And the whole time God says, you're doing this because you are supposed to be holy because I'm holy. That's the whole reason for law, right? So there's an expression of obedience in the fact that because some of that law reflects very similarly to how other people see God. They know they're not justified. They got to sacrifice something. Now, of course, God sets it apart by a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, is believing how he expressed, his character through written form, through these commandments, and whether we believe that matters to him or not, or they believe that matters to him, God, and then obeying that. And so it's tied in that sense. But of course, then you can ask, well, what about people apart from the law?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So because before the Levitical law, there was not a law, but still it goes back to what has, and this is why it's interesting for the progressive revelation of things. God's gonna judge you, if you will, on how much light you have in terms of understanding who he is and what he's revealed about himself. And I think it's a fascinating, thing. To give you a quick example, I hope you don't mind, John. One quick minute.
No, go for it. Let's talk about it.
To a couple of missionaries this week, and those of you, I think, Eddie looks like he's the only one that's Chinese, and he can verify this. But say in the Chinese language, the concept of righteousness, I was explaining to somebody. Many of you know that it's not a phonetic language. We don't spell things out. The thing is written, drawn out. This concept, whatever it is, it's drawn out so that people can understand. Okay, I understand what this word means because it kind of represented in the drawing. So just to let you know, even though this predates the gospel and everything else, the Chinese word for righteousness. Then if I were to give all 10 of us, hey, come up with a drawing in which you put you just express righteousness, like what would you draw, right? It's an abstract thing to be able to find what should I draw to express the word righteousness. Just to let you guys know, the Chinese word for righteousness is yi, or in I don't remember how to say it in Cantonese, but the word is two components put together. It's lamb over me. So the light that God gave to Chinese people thousands of years ago when they expressed this, there's already this covering of atonement that express your righteousness in this case, right? The just shall live by faith. To trust that you need to be covered, and there's this idea that written language is lamb over me, which is fascinating all to itself. But I won't take you guys can research that yourself.
That is cool. That is cool.
Absolutely beautiful. That is beautiful.
And okay, I want to take a couple of things that you said, Rich, and pull them out here for a second. You talked about progressive revelation, and then you also talked about this symbol. And let's just take a moment to look at this symbol and look at the passage that he wrote down and to Habakkuk. The Lord, verse 2, then the Lord answered to me and said, write this vision and make it plain on tablets. So it makes me wonder if somehow somewhere God told whoever is coming up with this part, make sure you write it down. This is what righteousness is. And now we're at this point where we can look back and say, oh, that makes total sense. That fits exactly with what God was telling us, right? There's this idea that that righteousness, we need, our sin has to be covered by a lamb, or has to be covered by the death of something. It's really, I like that. That's really cool. But now I want to talk about progressive revelation just a little bit. And this is really cool because what Rich mentioned is true, right? If we look at the things that you said, there was a time period where they didn't have that. If we look at the law, there was a time period that they didn't have that. And yet God's plan and what he says is here, the just shall live by his faith. And I just want to point out how that always works. And the reason that always works is back when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden in Genesis chapter 3, he tells them that Eve, there is going to be a son who's going to conquer Satan. There's going to be a son who's going to conquer death. And he says, Satan is going to bruise his heel or bruise his head, and he's going to crush. I don't remember if I'm getting this right. I probably should read it. But he says, and he's going to crush his head. Right. So there's this promise from all the way back at the very beginning that God is going to say that there's going to be a son that comes from woman. And that's really interesting because he tells Adam and Eve, it comes from woman. He doesn't say it comes from woman and man. It comes from woman that's going to save them. And the point that I'm bringing out here is as soon as they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they already have this promise. And I suspect that in Adam and Eve, when they have more children, they're looking to him like, are you the one that's going to be saving us? And it's really interesting. If you read Genesis, you'll get to Seth, where Seth is born. And there's this language that talks about him where they point him out. And you're like, why are you pointing out Seth? And part of the reason is I think Seth was born after this promise. And there's this expectation, maybe he's that one, because definitely Cain's not that one and Abel's dead. So maybe it's Seth. But the reason I'm bringing this out is God made a promise to mankind that he was going to send someone to save mankind. And that started way back then. And as time progressed, he gave more information about this one, about this anointed one, or the Messiah that he was called in the Old Testament. And the New Testament, we switched languages, so he's called the Christ. It's the same thing. It's this idea that there's going to be someone who's going to save mankind. And so he gave that promise a long time ago. Now, let's reread verses 2 and 3 and 4 and keep this in mind. What if God is definitely telling Habakkuk about this problem of prophecy, this promise of the Babylonians, but what if he's also reminding him about other promises? And one of those promises is the Messiah. Check out how cool these verses are. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. And here's the cool thing, right? If we're saying we trust in the Lord and God's reminding them that he also promised them salvation, eternal salvation through a Messiah, and he's reminding of this. This works for all of mankind. If they trust in this promise that God is going to save them, they will be saved. And the cool aspect of it is, even though they may not know his name is Jesus. That promise is fulfilled. For us, it's in the past. For them, it was in the future. And it seemed like it took a really long time, but at the same time, it happened perfectly at a time period where the news of who he was and who he is could be spread to all of the Gentiles, which again was another promise that God made. And so I love this whole aspect of it of, you know what? They could have been saved by trusting in Jesus as well. And then it was just a promise, but they could have been saved by that promise. What do you guys think? I'm excited about this. I think this is cool, but I'm feeling like you guys aren't on board.
I'm just makes me wonder about everything that happened yesterday and what I missed. And now I'm just on like hyper vigilant red alert for the messages to come today.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I need to trust in the Lord no matter what happens or what situation I find myself in, because being with him is the way you want to be, right?
Yeah.
The contrary is not very good. We know that.
All right. Well, we are almost out of time. So I just want to just remind us here that this is what Habakkuk is having. This conversation with the Lord is amazing. What the Lord says back to Habakkuk is incredible. And we have this amazing verse, behold the proud, his soul is not upright, but the just shall live by his faith. And here is when we talk about salvation, I like this. If you go to Romans 10:9, the bar of salvation is super low. It's accessible to everyone. It's just trust in the Lord, trust in his promises. And for us, there is still a promise, right? The promise is that when we die, we'll be resurrected. We will have eternal life. And there's some trust that has to happen there. And that's what God is saying is, you trust in him and that'll save you. Any last thoughts?
I think it's extremely encouraging, especially when you talk to people, that wonder about their relatives passing and whether they knew God or things like that. Because the reality is, I mean, we only see a certain portion, whereas we know that the Lord desires, the world to be saved. It'd be really interesting. I'm really curious how many people would make it like the thief on the cross simply by trusting in whatever was told them a long time ago, regarding only God can save you, believe that he can save you, and he's the only one that can save you. Of course, now we're in the future, we have the gospel, we have Jesus, absolutely 100%, but you need Jesus to be saved. But it's you never know what a person knows about Jesus, but I do believe if they humbly call out to God, before they pass, the justification comes from God. We don't get to say, and don't treat this as me saying you can be saved outside of Jesus. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying God looks at the heart of a person, the faith of a person based on what they know, and we can never determine that. Only the Lord knows. And it's amazing hope for people that wonder if I'm going to see, because I tell people, well, we don't know what's going to happen with your whoever passed away. The Lord could have saved them very last second. You would have never known. But here's your chance to be 100% sure. Because if you reject, we know what happens then, So it's a really interesting kind of way to kind of present the gospel for those that say, well, you're saying if I go to hell without Jesus, what about my parents? What about this who has passed away? I know they've never, but they don't really know, you don't know how God can minister to them the very last second of life.
I know there's a lot of people, when you're in heaven, you're going to look at somebody and go, how did he get in here? And then they look at you and they go, well, how'd you get in here? And that's really, a lot of stories that are out there of people on their deathbed just finally said, I accept Jesus. But again, we don't know. They may have said it, we've said the sinner's prayer, I know one guy, he says, I've said the sinner's prayer 20 times and I don't know if I'm saved or not. So it's like, well, we don't know.
That's a different question. Got to worry about that end too, right? Many will come to mind, to me that day and saying, Lord, Lord, and it's just not, and that's the opposite end of that. The people that pretend they have faith, but they never really trusted in God.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. Who would like to pray for us and close us out this morning?